Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum. Habemus papam. Eminentissimum, ac reverendissimum Dominum, Dominum Robertum Franciscum, Sancte Romane Ecclesiae, Cardinalem Prevost, qui sibi nomen imposuit Leonem XIV.
Well, hi again, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 103 of the Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. What a day. We're going to get into it a little bit more in depth on the election of Pope Leo XIV, which just is still taking some time to get used to saying that out loud. At least for a nerd like me. I hope it's the same for you because it's just, we're living history, you know? It's only anyways, we'll get into it. Just a quick for starters. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to hit the subscribe and the notification bell. Share it with your friends. Share the shorts with your friends. There's also the link in the description to our newsletter, Today in Papal History, if you have not subscribed there yet. And then also you can find all of our past episodes on your favorite podcast platform, but they're all at thepopecast.fm, which you can find super easily by going there. Okay, without further ado. So earlier today on Instagram, I posted a short live video with just some quick hits. Want to come on here. It's going to be, just fair warning, it's going to be slightly less polished just because the production time for a normal episode takes a bit longer than the time that was available. But regardless, we want to work through just a brief overview of who this Pope is, the first Midwestern Pope, first American Pope. Wild. Nobody saw it coming. And then some shock and surprise, kind of the initial reactions, some advice from a papal historian, armchair papal historian. At what point do you become not an armchair papal historian, maybe having a papal podcast with 100 episodes? I don't know. I don't make the rules. But at any rate, it still feels like, sitting back and watching. I'm not in Rome. I would have loved to be in Rome. But children and family duties and the day job called. So watching from afar, right? Just kind of some reflections there to maybe ponder can kind of be helpful as we embark on a new papacy. Just some first impressions on who this new Pope appears to be, what kind of struck me. Talk a little bit about the opinions that seem to be running rampant. It's inevitable. The news stations, secular and religious, need to talk about something, and there is a lot to talk about, but a lot of it gets into unnecessary speculation. So we'll kind of talk some about that and some second impressions. So I'm recording this later at night on Thursday, May 8th. Some things that I've heard throughout the day, some just more fleshed out thoughts, I think, after kind of mulling on it all day, just basking kind of the joy, the uniqueness of witnessing a new Pope at this moment in my life, witnessing this at such a moment in history for what seems like most of America. So that's kind of the order of things. And then just want to share some words from the man himself, what he said in his initial address, at least a snippet of it, because I think it was really profound. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I hope all of you were able to watch it. I was watching it, as I mentioned on Instagram earlier today, that and I mentioned earlier on this recording too, that I was, my wife's out of town for her brother's graduation. I've got a day job, project stacking up because it's the busy season. and I've got little kids. And so traveling to Rome, unfortunately, was not in the cards this time around. But still, the Lord makes a path for it. I was really hoping that I wasn't going to be bleary-eyed and groggy at 3 a.m. Pacific time to have to get up and react somehow and see what I'm watching and all that type of stuff, or maybe miss it when I'm in the car or whatever it might be. But happened to be working for a Catholic family who was also very excited about the papal election, and they were also following it. I'm walking up the stairs to start work. I was replacing some doors and trim for them, and and look down at my phone and I see white smoke, and I'm thinking, this isn't real. It's 9:15 in the morning. EWTN's not coming on for 15 more minutes. They're not supposed to be done with the second ballot. Bishop Barron said it's probably Friday. I was thinking it was going to be Monday before a new pope was elected, but lo and behold, here on the fourth ballot, apparently we have a pope. So run back downstairs, tell the folks who I'm working for. They couldn't believe it, so we pull up. I think I found NBC News at first, which was great. George Weigel, Bishop Barron, people who know what they're talking about when it comes to these sorts of things. And EWTN came out, and I think we finally were watching their coverage of it. And after however long it was, 45 minutes or an hour, the proto-deacon comes out, Cardinal Mamberti. So we knew right away that it was not him. He was kind of a front runner that the pillar had mentioned kind of in later days before the conclave started. So we knew it wasn't him. I was kind of hoping. He seemed like an interesting character. And he reads the famous lines, Annuncio Vobis Gaudium Magnum. I put the clip at the beginning of the episode here. And announces Cardinal Prevost. And as soon as I heard that, I didn't know anything really about him other than he was an American who had never served as a bishop in America, had been largely a diplomat for most of his career, but knew that he was American. And I think instantly I probably shouted it. It was like all a blur. My brain shut off, I think, as soon as I heard Prevost and shouted, oh, it's an American. And then heard that it was Leo XIV. And, something was in my eye after that point. Because listeners of the Popecast know, people who know me know, that Leo is pretty much at the top of my list of favorite papal names. If you listen to our last episode with Donald Paul Maddox, he actually predicted it. He said he was thinking of it had to be a Leo or a Gregory, which I think was a profound pick, and there's good reasons for it. Clarity being number one, just the church needing something a little bit, a man who's a little bit more careful in his words. Again, nothing against Pope Francis. Pope Francis had his own style, but I think there were times that it did cause legitimate confusion. So it seems like we got both of those. But that was the shock and the surprise. Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody. Nobody expects an American pope. Let's put it that way. I know Cardinal Prevost was on a lot of lists as a potential front runner. I think was he in the College of Bishops? Unfortunately, I'm not Joe Rogan. I don't have a Jamie, or who's Matt Fradd's guy, Thursday, whatever his name is. But I think he was in the rank of cardinal bishops. So he was up there. He was one of, I think, 3 or 4 who was among the highest rank of cardinals. So that kind of instantly, makes you more of a front runner than not, I suppose. But nobody expects an American pope. We all just think, the Italians kind of are annoyed by Americans. The American political system is kind of too intertwined with these sorts of things and it doesn't at all map on to the, American political structure. So you think of all those things, you don't think, no way an American pope. So just like wrapping our mind around that. And then the name Leo XIV, there was speculation that maybe even assumptions in some cases. Francis II seemed a little far-fetched. That would be a little too on the nose. John Paul III was kind of a favorite. Maybe if Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines was the one who was elected, maybe it would have been John Paul III. Benedict XVII, never really heard anybody saying that, even though that would be kind of cool. So it seemed like the sense would be another new name, whether it was, Thomas or Joseph, shout out Marilis, or, one of the old names, something that hadn't been used in 100 years, Pius XIII maybe. But the Jude Law show, the young pope, he was Pius XIII. So if it was an American, that would be on the nose, at least for the meme world crowd online. But yeah, so it kind of left Leo XIV, Gregory XVII, innocent and urban seemed like a we might never see one of those again. But at any rate, it ended up being Leo XIV. And the assumption is, I don't think we've heard so far. He's only been Pope for about 5 minutes, not even 24 hours in seriousness. He hasn't said specifically who he chose his name after, but this is kind of where I wanted to get in some weird little quirks of the day, the way that the Lord kind of ordained this to happen on May 8th, that today happened to be the feast of the apparition of St. Michael the Archangel, which I think came in 492. I'm not sure the entire story. I actually didn't even know that it was a feast until one of the people who was working at their house today said, today's the feast of the apparition of St. Michael the Archangel. And I thought, holy crap. He named himself Leo XIV, probably after Leo XIII. And Leo XIII famously is the one who wrote the St. Michael prayer. Not only that, but I think in the line of one of the great things that Pope Francis did was he never let people forget that the devil is real and has a real impact on our lives if we're not careful. What was it? The late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, I think, was the one who maybe said it. Several people probably have said it, but the best trick that the devil ever pulled off was to convince people that he didn't exist. So Pope Francis was one who never really let us forget that. And it seems like with Leo XIV, he's also not letting us forget that either. But I think it was just very fitting and very interesting. Time will tell. I'm sure he might commentate on that or something like that in time. Once people are asking him about the conclave or how he picked his name, maybe Leo XIII was on his mind. Leo XIII reigned for 26 years, I believe, 25 years and change, a little bit shorter than John Paul II, but he died in 1903. He was 93 years old. The story that you hear about him levitating, falling into a trance during Mass or something like that is unfortunately unsubstantiated. I think I looked into that once a while back, several years ago, and found that the details of that never came out. The earliest that they came out was 20 or 30 years afterwards in the early 1900s. But he did write the St. Michael prayer. That part is true. So there's that. Then there's also Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV. Again, I got to get used to that, not calling him Cardinal Prevost because he's not Cardinal Prevost anymore. So just a quick background on him. So he's the first American-born Bishop of Rome, Supreme Pontiff. And for the people who say, no, Pope Francis was the first American, somebody on Twitter, I think, X, said, come on, when you say you hate Americans, when you're a European and you're annoyed by somebody cutting you off in traffic or being too loud or something, are you really talking about somebody from Bolivia? No, you're not. You're talking about somebody from the U.S. So the first American, United States of American born Pope. He was born in Chicago, Illinois. So the first Midwestern Pope, for any fans of the Bellied Up podcast or Charlie Barron's or the You Betcha guy, I'm sure that will be making an appearance early and often for the next several months. That he got elected Ope and not Pope, that's a dumb joke. I'm going to cut that out. But he was born in Chicago, Illinois. He's a member of the Order of St. Augustine. He's the youngest of three boys. He spent a lot of his priestly life early on and then as a bishop in Peru. And I think when he was, it was Pope Francis who appointed him as Bishop of Chiclayo in Peru in 2015. He actually had to become a Peruvian citizen. There was some diplomatic agreement. I haven't had the time to look into that more deeply, but basically he's an American citizen and a Peruvian citizen as a result of his being the bishop there. And then as of 2023, he was named as the head of the dicastery for bishops, which is in charge of appointing the bishops and kind of handling all the cases of complaints against bishops and things of that nature from around the world. So had a very, a very high role in the Vatican, in the Roman Curia for the last couple of years, was named a cardinal as a result of that as well. But he's also been all over the place. He's been the prior general of the Order of St. Augustine. He's also the first Augustinian Pope, as an aside. But he was in charge of the entire order for a while, from 2001 to 2013. He was a pastor for a while. He worked in a diocese for a while. He was a seminary rector and teacher and administrator for a while. And then he also has gone also all over the globe doing various tasks for the church. And then also, I think, sits on 7 dicasteries, 7 commissions, some sort of something along those lines. So he's been incredibly embedded in the life of the institutional church. And again, for listeners of the show, you will remember that a lot of the pre-Pope life of the men who have occupied the office of Peter, a lot of the best ones have been the ones who have had boring jobs before that. They were able administrators. They, quietly rose through the ranks doing X, Y, and Z. They were well educated. All those sorts of things tend to produce kind of periods of peace, or hopefully some sort of administrative stability. Because Pope Francis did a lot. He did a lot of reforming in that sense. And there are many other people who are much more qualified than I am to speak into that more specifically. But Pope Francis wasn't a Roman insider. And we've, again, anybody who's listened to the Popecast or reads the Vaticanisti, the Vatican journalists, knows how important that is to be able to kind of play the game, to know the good, the bad, and the ugly of where rats may hide, for lack of a better term, where there's kind of holes and ways for things to be abused, as far as financial and administrative sleights of hand and all sorts of things. So he seems to know all of those things, which is a good sign. He's also a canon lawyer, which also helps to be in the interest of clarity, I think. So by all accounts, he was, he's a great pick. But yeah, grew up in Chicago, had normal parents, the youngest of 3 boys. I have 3 boys right now, so I have a sense of what the life of a household with 3 young boys is like. So I'm sure, he's probably not afraid of a fight. He's probably pretty tough being the youngest of the 3 too. Just practically grew up on the south side of Chicago. Most importantly, he's a White Sox fan, apparently. I saw somebody on X post earlier that the White Sox are so terrible that God decided to give them a pope among their ranks. So I thought that was kind of funny. But yeah, so and he was educated at Villanova. So I'm sure you'll see Villanova be, leaning heavily on that. Maybe it'll make their university a little more Catholic. I kid, but seriously. Okay. The shock and surprise. There's that, a little bit of background on him. One kind of caveat. I know we're pretty far into this already, but just kind of the other first impression, or one of the first impressions is it's okay for us all to chill out a little bit and just kind of enjoy the moment. Because, again, this has only happened in my lifetime. I was born in 1989. This has only happened when John Paul died 1, 2, 3 times. This is the 4th time. This is the 4th time I've seen John Paul died, Benedict retired, Benedict was elected, Francis was elected. Gosh, forgive me, it's late. Benedict was elected, Francis was elected, and now Leo XIV has been elected. So three popes, 3 papal elections in my lifetime. Even I think for my parents, my dad was born in 1953, so he had 3 more. So it was 1958, John the 23rd, 1963, Paul the 6th, 1978, John Paul the 1st, and John Paul the 2nd, and then Benedict and Francis. So even among the people who were, 70, 80, 90 years old, there's only been a handful in a century. I think the average over 2,000 years is something like 7 years per pope. But in the last 300 years, I think it's been more like 12, 13 years per pope. And that's counting people like John Paul I, who were pope for 33 days, or for a very short time at any rate. John the 23rd was pope for 5 years. So it doesn't happen all that often. We're living history. Leo XIV, the name Leo hasn't been used in 122 years. So I think first impressions, I would just encourage everyone to just enjoy the moment and just kind of, bask in the glory that he came out onto the loggia and had the mozzetta and the stole on that were so iconic from the elections of Benedict and John Paul II, John Paul I, Paul VI. I think probably John the 23rd. That one was in black and white, if I remember, so it was a little harder to tell. But that's, traditional. Like, he looked like a pope. One of my other first impressions was that he looked like a pope. He reminded me of John Paul II, and just kind of like had the round head, the slightly receding hairline. You could still see a little bit up on the top with the Zucchetto on. And he just looked very papal, which I appreciate, obviously. But I think that's good because, again, Pope Francis was a lot of things. He did a lot of good things. I am probably as big a Pope Francis fan as you'll find, but who also has the understanding that we live in the real world, that the world is messy, that he did a lot of not great things either, some things that I personally didn't like. And one of those was I understood why he did it, but one of those was kind of shirking so many of the trappings of the papacy. Because I think there's value to that. We don't have to... I would love the papal tiara to come back, but I understand why that maybe didn't. Because it was... I just read the three the other day. It was, spiritual head of the church, the governor of kings, and leader of the world, or something like that. Which, not quite, maybe a little ostentatious, but still, some of the pomps. I love nice vestments that are just beautiful and take your mind and your heart to someplace else, because there's a reason that Scripture calls the world a vale of tears. And there's a reason that Saint Therese said the world is thy ship and not thy home. And I think the papacy is a visible sign because the Lord left, the Catholics believe, Jesus left the Catholic Church as a visible sign of unity. The office of Peter is a visible sign of unity for Christ for Christ and his church on earth. I'm kind of bungling that, I think, but you get the idea. I think there's a good reason that those sorts of traditions developed, and I think there's a good reason to keep them. So I really loved that he came out on the loggia and had those vestments on. Next thing, almost instantly, there was a lady on Substack. It was just unfortunate. The first thing that people can say sometimes is, oh, he was associated with so-and-so. He's associated with Father James Martin, so he's going to be X, Y, and Z, and all these sorts of things. Just ignore those if you can. If you have an eloquent and charitable way to reply to those, do. And say, he's been Pope for 5 seconds. Can we not enjoy anything? I think I replied to a lady on Instagram. Can we just chill? It's okay to chill out sometimes. It's okay to chill. There's enough problems in the world. It's a happy day. There was his name's escaping me, but on Instagram, a guy posted a great little series of images. How best to respond to the election of a pope. And the first one says, please smile and be joyful. Smiling does not equal heresy or unfeeling or that you're effeminate or something like that. Just relax. It's okay to say that to those people, I think. And to take this moment as an opportunity to, evangelize in the sense that you have the whole world watching. I was just talking to my mom earlier, just kind of marveling at how this sort of Father Rich Kuntz and I were talking about this on his episode as well. How we have this interest, him and I, and a handful of other people, where we go, so deep into these little niche things, all these aspects of papal history, and know all this useless information, whatever. And normally it's just, a small group of people who care. But now, all of a sudden, everyone cares. I don't know how many of you know who Pat McAfee is, but he has a huge show on ESPN, a huge following. It's a great sports show because he's independent. He does great work, but he's a little vulgar. He's a lot off color sometimes. But it's a great show for what it's for. But even they had the live stream going of when Cardinal Mamberti came out onto the loggia and when Leo XIV came out onto the loggia. And to be able to articulate what all those things are and leave that be and just be with people and sit in the beauty of it, the majesty of it. Because who was it? C.S. Lewis, I think, said that the truth is like a lion. All you have to do is let it out and it will do its job. I forget how the quote ends, but I think that's kind of a first impression too, is if you see those sorts of opinions, try to gently squash them. Encourage people to not be so stodgy and grumpy, because life is too short. And that kind of leads into another one. So I talked about on Instagram earlier, just something that is kind of a pet thing that I always like to hammer on, I guess, is in every age of the church, especially for listeners to the Popecast, in every age of the church, there have been people who have curried favor with people in power, whether it's a powerful cardinal, whether it's the Pope himself, to enrich themselves, to enhance their personal profile, to again, sleight of hand tricks to win power, money, pleasure, honor, all those sorts of things. At times, it's been the Pope himself. Granted, there have been bad popes, obviously, but in every case, even including the best ones, and still in our time, of course, there are people who will be currying favor and getting close to the Pope in order to enrich themselves, in order to enrich their profile. We saw this with Cardinal Becciu with Pope Francis, and they take advantage of certain weaknesses. So Pope Francis wasn't the best administrator, wasn't the best judge of people from what it looked like. And I likened him to Pope Benedict XIII, as I think I've mentioned on a prior episode, where a man could be very personally faithful, very personally holy. I think Benedict XVI maybe had some of this too, but just not up for the administrative demands of the job. And it's such that there's, people who get away with all sorts of things, and then the Pope ends up getting blamed. And I think it's good to sort of be worldly wise, or at least be aware that sort of thing's happening, to look at it and say, this doesn't pass a smell test. If there's all sorts of these other good things happening, not that a Pope can't do anything wrong, but there's all sorts of these other good things happening, that maybe this thing that seems kind of out of left field was had the Pope's name put on it, but wasn't actually of him, or wasn't actually something that was done with his knowledge, or the buck stops with him, but still. And I think the same way for a lot of people in the media, particularly religious media, in some corners. Now, of course, the likes of, as I mentioned on Instagram, the Pillar, amazing. The Catholic Traveler, outstanding. There are a lot of great resources of people who are, seem to be pursuing truth and reporting truth in an honest way, even if it's painful. Again, this doesn't preclude us from bad news. However, there are also a lot who will post the most sensational headline, or paint something in the most unflattering light. We saw this a ton with Pope Francis. Again, Pope Francis was not perfect, but in order to win clicks, in order to win views, I believe people are imperiling their own souls. So it's at the end of the day, it's going to be all worked out in the end, I suppose. But just beware of places like that. If you read something that says, "Oh my gosh, the Pope is going to change the teaching on X, Y, or Z," think probably not, and let's go read the source material. That's what I try to do here, obviously in a lot of cases, but and guys at the Pillar and other resources are too. But just know that if it seems a little too fantastical, it's probably the case. There was a lot of times with Pope Francis, again, he wasn't the most clear. He didn't have the best clarity, the best record on clarity. But you could at least read those things with at least impartial eyes, or as much as possible. And more or less, in most of the cases that I saw, see what he was getting at, see what point he was driving at. Even if it was maybe ham-handed at times, even if it was not worded the best, that you could at least glean what it meant. I think a great example of this is when Father Mark Goring was on with Matt Fradd on Pints with Aquinas, explaining the whole fiducia supplicans issue, where it seemed like, if you read only the headlines, the Pope allowing blessing same-sex couples. Well, no, that was not true. It was more of like an attempt to thread the needle. And again, reasonable minds can disagree, but Father Mark Goring, who is no lib, to use an internet term that I normally don't like, he's not one who falls into that camp. But he was kind of reading that with, okay, this is an impossible task, and so it seems like they did the best they could with the demands that they were given. Just something to keep in mind. And then the last thing I want to share before I just share some words from Pope Leo XIV himself, the second impressions, things I've been kind of mulling on all day. So the first thing is just how good the Lord is. I mean, It's just amazing to think that, as Bishop Barron said on, I think, EWTN yesterday, it's a great mystery that the church has endured for so long. Obviously, Jesus said to Peter, "You're Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Like, Jesus affirmed that the church would endure until he returned. But it's still a comfort for us, I think. It's at least a comfort for me to see that the successor of Peter still exists. Not that there was any doubt. There was no rulers coming in. There was no Napoleon coming in saying to Cardinal Consalvi he's going to destroy the church. Because, of course, Cardinal Consalvi said in 1800, "My son, you're trying to do what bishops and priests have been trying to do for 18 centuries. You're not going to do that." So it's not like there was any doubt when Pope Francis died that the church was going to somehow end. But when you see a new pope appear on the loggia, you think, wow, the unbroken line of succession is still unbroken. And I think there's a real grace, a real comfort in that, to know that whatever comes of however many years, please God, let it be a lot, that Pope Leo XIV reigns in the chair of St. Peter, that he is the visible sign of unity. He was elected by the cardinals to succeed St. Peter, and it's been 2,000 years. He probably will preside over the 2000th anniversary in 2033, by all accounts. So that's one thing. Another thing is just a bunch of weird modern firsts. So as I've been perusing, man, kudos to X, because the For You section, for me, is perfectly curated. It's a nice combination of memes about sports and the Pope, which is a great day. It's like the best day for content since Trump got elected, I think. But it's a bunch of weird modern firsts that probably seem plausible. He grew up in Chicago, so he's the first Midwest Pope. But he was the first Pope with his own personal Twitter and Facebook, which is something. He's been the first Pope to play Wordle. Apparently, I think the interview with one of his brothers said that the two of them would play Wordle together virtually every day or as often as they could. So the first Pope to play Wordle, and probably the first Pope to go to a Menards and a Culver's and maybe a Cheesecake Factory, an In-N-Out. I don't know. There's not In-N-Outs in the Midwest, but Culver's and Menards probably for sure. So some of my Midwest follows have pointed that out. And I also discovered that today is the birthday of Venerable Fulton Sheen. So the great Archbishop I'm sure everybody knows who he is, but in case you don't, he was the great TV evangelist. He was, while being the Bishop of Rochester, New York, and I think was he the director of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith in the Archdiocese of New York for a while. But he won an Emmy. He beat Milton Berle and oh gosh, it's escaping me who the other super popular TV show was in prime time. He had a half-an-hour primetime show in the 50s where all he did was give a homily, more or less, but in a really entertaining way with chalkboard and all those sorts of things. So he's a venerable. His beatification cause was put on hold a couple of years ago, and it's just kind of in limbo. But he grew up in Peoria, Illinois, which is in the same state, obviously, as Chicago, not that far away. And so one wonders, Pope Leo XIV gets elected on Venerable Fulton Sheen's birthday. And so one can hope that whenever, please God, an American visit comes from Leo XIV, that maybe we'll have a beatification for Fulton Sheen. So I think that's pretty neat. And then maybe a last one. As far as the new Pope's positions, the papacy, getting elected to the papacy does weird things to a guy, it seems like. Again, listeners to the show, you'll know. There's all sorts of strange things. In the Renaissance, there was guys who had mistresses and illegitimate children, and then they would get elected Pope, and all of a sudden they think, oh man, I need to start taking this more seriously. And there's all of these reports. Even Alexander VI, the worst Pope of them all, at a certain point, towards the end of their life or right when they get elected, that, those guys repented of their, objective moral ills and sins and lives of depravity and debauchery. So obviously this is much better. There's no evidence whatsoever that now Pope Leo XIV has done any of those things. But the papacy does weird things to people that, you can't always rely on the statements, behaviors, personnel choices that a cardinal made before he was elected Pope. Because, well, for a variety of reasons. one, minds change, things, nuances grow, even for a man of 69 as Pope Leo XIV is. But also he's serving as boss. And so what the boss wants, the boss gets. And so especially when it comes to the Catholic Church, obedience is one of the keys to heaven, literally, so especially in a case like that, where to be a good servant, that sounds terrible, but to be a good servant of the Holy Father, I think is more important than maybe doing what you want, because it's a good way to get fired in a lot of cases, even especially in the church. So I think that you might see some things that are predictable. I assume we'll probably see things that aren't predictable, that we could never see. He already seems to be a pope who wants to strive after more clarity, for instance. So anybody who watched his first address to the world saw that he had prepared remarks. I've never seen that in any of the other videos of popes being introduced for the first time where they had prepared remarks. It's always been understood to just be a sort of off the cuff thing. Granted, John Paul II was an actor, was a great philosopher, was an incredible mind, an autodidact, like a super genius. So he probably had a teleprompter in his head. Benedict XVI was a great theological mind, so he was probably a little bit similar, but he just had a nice turn of phrase whenever he would speak, and it was very beautiful. And it didn't have to be. It was clear just in the nature of who he was. And then Pope Francis, that address was just a simple "Good evening, buonasera," which I thought was beautiful too. And then "Please pray for me." But then we all know how the rest of that papacy went. So often there was just a desire for more clarity. So I think in his use of notes, clearly writing something down and saying it, maybe is a slight nod to something like that. And then also, I guess, just to the name, again, Leo XIII is known as the Pope of the Rosary because he wrote 11 encyclicals just on the Rosary. Leo XIII did. Granted, they were a couple of pages long, where the last three popes have written billion-word encyclicals. It feels like they just go on and on and on forever. So maybe we're getting back to something like that. And I think to end that thought, a lot of that commentary is just missing the point, because who cares what political party he was registered for when he lived in America? Maybe it was the Republicans because of the life issues. Who knows? On all sorts of other administrative things, at the end of the day, who cares? Is he a man who follows Jesus and can lead others to it too? Because that's the Pope's job. That was Peter's job, to set an example after Christ. He was crucified in the same way St. Peter was. And so in that sense, a bishop's job is to preach, to govern, and to sanctify. And so governing is a piece of it, but 2/3 of the pie is preaching and sanctifying, to make people holy and to preach to them about the gospel. And so that will be the ultimate test. And by all accounts, in his words from his first address, that he's doing pretty good so far. So I think we'll probably close with this. I've been going on for a while. It's kind of late again. Apologies for the slightly less polished version of the episode, but I hope this has been helpful. Again, thank you for my oldest listeners in terms of how long you've listened. Thank you also to my oldest listeners in terms of age too. But thank you to the people who have endured the longest with the Popecast and for your continued encouragement. I think we're going to be back for good. But bear with me. Pray for me to persevere and keep producing these episodes, because I love doing them. It's so great to dive deeply into the history of the church, but I think it's also a good service to the church itself too. And this is not my doing, but just kind of, again, presenting what it is, to bring hopefully some comfort, to say, don't panic about the world's problems, because they've happened plenty of times before, truly. So we'll close here with just a little snippet from Pope Leo XIV, which just, I know I said it at the beginning, but it just takes some getting used to. It's just so exciting to have another Leo in the chair of Peter. So he, when he was welcomed onto the balcony, welcomed by the world, appeared on the loggia for the first time. Here's what he said. Peace be with all of you. Dearest brothers and sisters, this is the first greeting of the risen Christ, the good shepherd who gave his life for God's flock. I too would like this greeting of peace to enter your hearts, to reach your families and all people wherever they are, all of the people all over the earth. Peace be with you. This is the peace of the risen Christ, an unarmed peace and a disarming peace, humble and persevering. It comes from God, God who loves us all unconditionally. We still have in our ears that weak but always courageous voice of Pope Francis as he blessed Rome. The Pope who blessed Rome gave his blessing to the world, to the entire world that Easter morning. Allow me to follow up on that same blessing. God loves us, God loves you all, and evil will not prevail. We are all in the hands of God. Therefore, without fear, united hand in hand, with God and among ourselves, we move forward. We are disciples of Christ. Christ precedes us. The world needs his light. Humanity needs him as the bridge to allow it to be reached by God and by his love. Long live Pope Leo XIV. Well, that's it for this episode 103. Thank you again for listening, watching, wherever you're seeing this. Please like and share. Again, if you have only been listening to this on audio and you still are, we are posting every new episode now on YouTube and then posting a bunch of shorts as well. So hopefully that'll be helpful, make it a little bit more easily digestible. You can find the Popecast on Instagram most especially, but also Twitter. Handles are at the Popecast, and all of that will be linked in the description. So until next time, let us pray for our new pontiff, Pope Leo XIV. Long may he reign, and we will see you next time. And above all, never forget, these are strange times we live in, but they are no stranger than in ages past. Until next time.